They brought in the ark of God and set it inside the tent that David had pitched for it, and they offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before God. When David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the offerings of well-being, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord, and he distributed to every person in Israel, man and woman alike, to each a loaf of bread and a portion of meat and a cake of raisins. He appointed certain of the Levites as ministers before the ark of the Lord to invoke, to thank, and to praise the Lord, the God of Israel. With harps and lyres, Asaph was to sound the cymbals, and the priests Benaiah and Jehaziel were to blow trumpets regularly before the ark of the covenant of God. Then on that day, David first appointed the singing of praises to the Lord by Asaph and his kindred. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, call on his name, make known his deeds among the peoples, sing to him, sing praises to him, tell of all his wonderful works. Glory in God's holy name, and let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice. Seek the Lord and God's strength. Seek God's presence continually. May God bless the reading of Scripture today. Back in the late 1990s, I was pastor of a church in Michigan, which added a contemporary worship service. The long-established traditional service continued unchanged with its hymns and its pipe organ. The contemporary service included a rock-style praise team with guitars, electric bass, a drum set, electronic keyboard, and 6 young adults singing into microphones. The praise team leader was an enthusiastic 20-something-year-old with no formal music training, but a passionate love for Jesus and a lot of personal charisma. He had no trouble recruiting teenage volunteers to sing and to play instruments in the new service, even though participation in the praise team required attendance for a full month at twice-weekly rehearsals before you were allowed to sing on a Sunday morning. There are 2 of those praise singers in worship today, shaking their head and hiding a little bit. A first-generation Filipino-American immigrant, Ace, was active in the Asian community of Grand Rapids. In addition to leading our church praise team, he led a Christian rock band called the Revelations, which performed at many venues in the city. The band members were all immigrants who had spent their childhoods in other countries and became U.S. citizens. All were passionate about their Christian faith. After Ace had been leading our contemporary service for about a year, members of other churches who had heard the Revelations perform in concert would sometimes ask Ace if he maybe had a worship team that would be willing to come and to share his highly energetic rock style with their church on a Sunday. Well, one such invitation came from the pastor of a very young immigrant congregation of folks from Southeast Asia. The pastor, a recent arrival in the States himself, was eager to rock the house of his youthful congregation of Vietnamese, Cambodian, Filipino, and Burmese Christians. The volunteer praise team was honored and excited to have a public performance outside of Sunday morning, so they doubled up their already strenuous rehearsal schedule for the weeks leading up to their big day. They packed up the drums and the amps and all their gear, and they drove to a rented metal building where the other church was meeting. About 100 young immigrants packed the room. Worship began with prayers in several different languages, and then the host pastor, speaking in English, introduced Ace and the praise team from our church. The guitars wailed, the drummer kept a strong, steady beat. It was Kristen's dad, by the way, a middle-aged drummer with high school singers. The wide-eyed teenagers sang intently into their microphones. They sang, "I'm coming back to the heart of worship. I'm trading my sorrows. Shout to the Lord. Every move I make with you." And then the grand finale, "Our God is an awesome God." When the praise team was finished, the host pastor came forward again and he took the microphone from Ace's hand and dragged him into the center of their makeshift stage and lined up the rest of the praise team behind him. And he turned to Ace and practically shouted into the microphone, "Ace, you are an awful leader. All that music was so awful. Your praise team is very, very awful. Thank you so much for coming." The pastor was beaming with joy. The congregation was applauding enthusiastically. And while it's true that the first dictionary definition for the word awful is very bad or unpleasant, the next two definitions are exceedingly so and inspiring awe and reverence. Synonym, awesome. The problem is, of course, that in popular American usage, we define awful as the opposite of awesome. And that nuance was lost on both pastor and congregation that night. I suspect that story is still told with frequency among the congregation I served back in Michigan. It was Ace who brought the story back and told it in worship to us because he thought it was just so funny. But the story got extra life because many of the traditional worshipers thought awful was exactly the right word for the music that was being sung at that other service every Sunday. With a big computer screen at the front of the sanctuary and a drum set to the side of the chancel steps and an electronic keyboard sharing space with the pipe organ console, pews and chairs filled with teenagers wearing low-rise jeans and high-rise crop tops and pierced belly buttons. Awful and awesome. Awful didn't seem so much a confusion over idiom as a moment of truth-telling about what was happening. The under 30 crowd at the contemporary service now far outnumbered those who preferred the familiar hymns, and many worried. Bringing electrified instruments into the sanctuary had led us from true worship to pandering entertainment. So this funny story about the words awful and awesome became a story larger than life for a while. Today in our stewardship series, we are challenged to consider how we connect to God through our worship, which begs the question, what's worship? And how do we know that when we gather, we are engaging in worship, rather than seeking entertainment or indulging our own vanity? The word worship is defined as the feeling or expression of reverence for a deity. Other synonyms include veneration, adoration, exaltation. To worship is to express awe. To worship is to be full of awe. Awful. The real question is not how that is expressed, as it is to whom is that awe directed, and with how much sincerity and authenticity. The distinguishing matter between worshiping and being entertained is not the matter of long blue curtains versus flat screen TV sets, or pews versus chairs, or Gothic architecture versus a metal pole building. Neither is it between projected words on a screen versus printed hymnals, or pipe organs versus guitars, or choirs versus praise teams. It's not even, I know this is heresy here, it's not even singing well versus singing poorly, or preaching from years of theological training, or from the gut of a newly converted believer. Authentic worship can and does happen in all of these contexts. Because bringing God our authentic worship is not about any of these stylistic issues or tools that we use to facilitate worship. We read a lot about worship as we comb through the Old Testament, and we know, as we saw in the reading that we just had, that the practice of worship included every instrument of the ancient world: singing and dancing, confessions, sacrifices, high places, shrines, special calendars, prayers, rituals, feasts, shouting, dancing, processions, incense, lamps, candles, oracles, the sacred recitation of ancient stories, special garments, blessings, and more. And key to our theme for this month, worship involved sacrificial giving. Now, when I mention sacrificial giving, what image does that conjure for you? What do you think I mean when I say sacrificial giving? I suspect that for most of us, that phrase elicits thoughts about giving more money than we think we can afford. It sounds like a call to negatively affect people's lives, causing pain, thus qualifying the gift as a sacrifice. But that is not what sacrifice means in Christian theology. We are to give to God our reverence, our awe, and also to give God our sacrifices. But how do we know what makes it a sacrifice? The words sacred and sacrifice come from the same root, and in a very real way, when we make something sacred or holy, it becomes a sacrifice. And by the act of sacrificing what we have brought to worship, we make that sacred. To sacrifice something is to release it. Once something has been offered as a sacrifice, we can't take it back again. In primitive cultures where the word originated, it meant making something sacred by dedicating it to the gods, rather than consuming it for oneself. In biblical times, this might be an animal, or a grain offering, or a sword, or a piece of jewelry. The point is, you took something valuable to you and you increased its value by giving it away, by letting it go, making it a sacrifice to God. It all sounds strange to modern ears, and I'm confident no one in this sanctuary brought a young goat or a pigeon with them as their offering. But when we place our financial gifts in the offering plate, we are making the money that we have earned at our jobs or through our investments into a sacred act of worship, releasing something we value into a realm where we fully relinquish control over it. And that is an act of worship, every bit as much as the prayers that we say or the songs that we sing. And when we perform that act of worship with our hearts truly, completely focused on God, reverently, that's a sacred moment. Giving God our worship includes this act of financial stewardship. But our true sacrifice of worship is more than just that one act as the trays are being passed in church. To say we will generously give God our worship means to approach the entire time when we are here in the sanctuary as an act of sacrificial giving. It asks of us that we relinquish our control over the rest of the day and the rest of the week, at least for this time when we are here in this place, making time holy. In many ways, the first sacrifice that all of you made today was the decision to get out of bed and head to this building to spend an hour with one another and with God. Having committed to that action, you relinquished the endless other possibilities for how you could be spending this morning instead. Sleep, housework, home improvement projects, studying, reading, watching TV, sports, brunch with friends. You had a lot of other options instead of being in this place. The question of whether the time spent in this room is worship then becomes, what do we all do with this time now that we're here? Do we bring it forward to the throne of an awfully awesome God as a gift to be laid down with attentiveness? Or do we just sit in the building distracted and disengaged? When we gather to give reverence in awe of God, when we give our sacrificial offering of money, do we also give over this time as a gift focused on God? For the last couple of days, I have had that wonderful experience of being able to be in a room with people I dearly love that I don't get to see all of the time. My daughter Alexis and one of my dear daughters of the church in Grand Rapids, Kristen, are here visiting. Lucas, who lives here in Champaign, or Urbana now I should say, came out to the farm and has spent the last couple of nights, and David came over and spent the night last night too. and just being together in that room. Do you know that feeling? You're just all warm and fuzzy inside because you're in the presence of people you love and you want to be with. But just being in the room doesn't mean being fully present. That's a choice that we make. Have you ever had that experience, and I know I have, of realizing you wasted it? That you were on your phone, on a tablet, on a smartphone or a laptop, and those people were right here, but they didn't get your attention. My daughter never lets me get away with that. Come make me something to eat. It's be with us. Let us see your eyeballs. Let's be engaged with one another. And I think the same thing happens when we come to church. We can be in the building and go home and realize I missed it. I wasn't fully present. I wasn't giving my attention to the congregation and to God because I was thinking about tomorrow and the big thing that's happening next week, and I was so distracted rather than fully present. But when we give ourselves and our time and our full attention, we make time sacred in worship with our full selves. An authentic act of sacrifice involves being attentive to the moment. Today, as we give God our true worship, we become generously connected to one another and to the divine. Something holy happens, and this time becomes different from other time. We're called to whatever particular style of music moves us and inspires our thoughts to be lifted higher, to direct all our attention even away from the instruments and the singers and the preachers, to the one to whom it is all being offered as a generous gift. And then, when we do that, our awful, awesome God can receive our joy and our reverence, our sacrifices, and the sacred time we share. May it be so as we now come to the table and share the gift.